Welcome to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. It's a limited series for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. We highlight the influential voices, partners, and leaders who are driving innovation, research, and development, creating new market opportunities and new ways of doing business in the mining industry.
My name's Roy Slack. I've been involved in mining for 45 years, and right now I'm director on a couple of companies, director on Cementation Board and on Torex Gold Resources. I'm the former president of the CIM, so still quite involved in the CIM activity, particularly the Health and Safety Society, and have a website, Cranky Old Men Drinking Beer. So I keep busy with a number of different things. But the mining-related things,
right,
I assume we're going to talk about.
Well, we could probably blend all of them. That's probably not a bad thing. I often tell the guys I do the podcast with, you bring the breadcrumbs and I'll bring the pigeons, and we'll sit here and we'll talk about whatever it is we want to talk about. So get back into the being cranky. Just tell me about this whole event, because I was telling to somebody the other day, I've been living in Toronto since 1968. I've been in media in Toronto for 40 years. Up until this year, had no idea.
Best kept secret?
Entirely, right? That PDAC is the biggest mining gathering in the world, and that this province is at the center of that attention.
I think the public has an image of a prospector.
Right.
From
Sure.
Bugs Bunny shows or from whatever. Is it Yosemite Sam? But Toronto is the economic center of prospecting in terms of the Toronto Stock Exchange and the number of mining companies on it. So it makes sense that the largest mining show for developing of new mines and prospecting is in Toronto. And it's not just, Canada's a world leader in mining, but in this case, in this conference, you see every country in the world that's involved in mining probably has a presence here. And so you've got a real mix here. You've got the mining companies who are trying to attract investors or employees. And then you've got the service providers who are trying to provide services to those mining companies. And then you've got the countries that are interested in Canadian companies exploring and servicing in their country. So it's a real mix of people and companies and countries, and it all comes together this week at PDAC.
So we're not just talking about the active extraction from sites here in Canada. We're actually exporting the skill and the talent and the ability to other countries?
One way of looking at it, but most of the larger mining companies now are multinational. So you'll have a mining company that may have mines in Canada, in the United States, Mexico, Africa, wherever. So more and more our industry is really global. And now if you're a junior, maybe you've got an exploration play in one country, but as mining companies get bigger, they diversify, and often they are multinational.
I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they said one of the biggest challenges in terms of the direction for the sector, the industry writ large, is, last year, the last couple of years, was a problem with capital, just getting capital into the system. Where are we with that? And
I think it's still a challenge.
Coming out of that? Yeah, okay.
It's still a challenge for our industry for a couple of reasons. One is public perception of mining. So the off the street investor, mining is typically high risk, high reward investment, and I think it's evolved from that into a solid investment. The capital, we've had a challenge in our industry in delivering projects on time, on budget.
Get in line.
You know what? Every industry has.
Sure, absolutely.
And there is a U of T professor did a study across public and private sector, all kinds of construction, and found in general projects are behind schedule and over budget. That doesn't, just because everyone else is that way, that doesn't excuse us. Capital is hard to come by, and the investment of capital, needs a certain rate of return for those investors. there's a mix within our industry. There's some great investments. There's some investments that didn't pan out. No pun intended. But that's mining, and that's actually any other industry when you look at it.
Yeah, and I agree. The problem is once you have that mindset embedded in a general perception culturally out there, it's hard to shake that, right? I mean, that becomes a negative. It doesn't matter if it's a negative for everybody else building infrastructure or whatever it happens to be. If you get tagged with that, it's a hard thing to shake. So at what level is the industry, or is there a coordinated effort even to change that perception?
Well, so the short answer is yes, but I'm going to give you more than a short answer. Mining Association of Canada and many mining organizations recognize a problem with the public perception. So there was a real effort to make people understand that the microphone we're using, the electronics, the lights, all of that needs mining. So your bicycle,
your telephone,
everything.
Yeah.
So recent studies by the Mining Association of Canada, public gets that. They know that they like minerals. They just don't like mining. So that's our catch-22. And our next step as an industry is to be socially responsible, to support the communities we live and work in, to be conscious of the environment and leave things in a better state than they were when we got there. There's a lot of companies that are completely committed to that. And that's the next stage of public perception that I see. The public understands minerals are important. Now what they have to understand that mining is a sustainable industry and can provide those minerals without harming the environment.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the phrase, leave it better than we found it feel to it. And that is an indigenous approach to the environment. That is the indigenous approach to natural resources, mining or forestry, for example. And I'm finding the more conversation I have here is that when we include the questions to the First Nations indigenous communities that are involved in mining particularly, it's as if they've been sort of sitting there waiting, and all of a sudden now, the Western approach is catching up to the indigenous traditional approaches in many respects, that their old wisdom has become this new social way of thinking or the new science behind our innovation. And I think it's a fascinating evolution that's happening right in front of our eyes.
I would, and it goes beyond indigenous, because if we look around the world, you need to engage the communities that you live and work in. And if that community is indigenous, then you have to seek to understand. How's the saying? Seek to understand before trying to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get it quite right. But it goes beyond indigenous, because if you're doing work in Mexico, if you don't engage the community, you won't be in operations long. And it's about early engagement. It's about creating jobs. It's about being cognizant of the impacts you'll have on the people, which includes the environment, includes the economy, all kinds of things. And I think we've been focusing on that for a while, and we're starting to learn the right way to do it. Because whenever you start doing something like that, you make a lot of assumptions. And then based on the things you get wrong, you change them, you begin to understand more. And I think the mining industry is making that transition. And
is it running out of time, though? I mean, did you get to a point where that there's the diminishing return on that effort to actually change hearts and minds around the perception?
There are companies that have lost their license to mine because they've lost their social license.
Right.
And everyone's aware of that. And everyone knows, you don't need case studies to say, well, Company A isn't up there right now because they didn't engage the community. Mm-hmm. So it's not just. I like to compare it to safety and our progress there. Safety went from compliance to commitment. What I mean by that, there was legislation that you had to follow to protect your people. But there was a point in our industry where we recognized that the legislation was the minimum. And that's where we began to see commitment to safety. And the commitment is going beyond compliance. And in safety, it was more defined, I think. But in terms of culture, in terms of engaging the community, I see more and more companies that are committed, not just because they have to do it, but because they want to do it.
Well, at the end of the line, there's a bottom line. And if you don't have to look very far to realize that if you do that properly, safety is a good example. Having fewer injured workers with time off away from work actually saves you money.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a productivity issue there. But also then around that perception around the social metrics that we're measuring now, there is a sort of a social return on investment that people are beginning to really look at, and not just people in the room who are doing the work. It's the average person on the street who's looking at company A and saying, okay, but what is the social benefit of you being in our community, right? And I don't have to understand the C-suite intrigue or anything else that's going on.
You mentioned a return on investment, which for years, as financial people, as engineers, you want some measure of success. As an investor, as a shareholder, you want some measure of success. Return on investment was and is an easy way to evaluate a project or a company. But I think more and more companies are finding some of the things we're doing, like community engagement, not as easy to measure the return on investment. But it's getting to a point that if you don't do it, there is no mine.
Right.
There is no project. There is no return. So it's not just how much return will there be. If you don't do this, there won't be any.
It's foundational.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to go back to this whole idea of making sure we're listening. And I hear often say, well, we're listening to you. But the question then becomes, was I heard? There's a nuanced step sometimes that it's okay. And therein lies this whole issue around greenwashing and so on, where you can do things for the sake of appearing to do the right thing. I think we certainly hit that wall a while ago, but from what you're saying and in my own sense of what's going on, I think we're making a turn away from that where it's not just compliance, it really is about commitment on a number of levels, particularly when you talk about ESG.
I think and this is society in general, is on to that.
Yeah.
This whole,
and that's why there's a commitment.
And there's a whiplash now.
Sure.
Are you doing it for the right reasons?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you doing Are you doing safety to save money, or are you doing safety to protect your people?
Right.
And if you can get a win-win, that's even better. But the first reason you should be doing it is because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's either a moral imperative, but and we're getting that. I know a number of companies that operate that way, and I'm on a few boards where I see people that are focused on these things for the right reason, and it's really encouraging.
And that culture is growing. There's no question about it. Even beyond mining, we do a lot of work with forestry as well, so we're seeing it happen there as well. So you've described that sort of the dynamic between the mining industry, the business of mining, the communities, whether it's indigenous or non-indigenous. Those are two important parts to it. Now we enter government into that mix.
Yeah.
And, I was talking to somebody yesterday about the Ring of Fire. And the communities are talking to each other, and mining is talking to each other, but government, in many cases, in that case, can't get out of its own way sometimes, or gets in the way of these conversations. Where's the sweet spot there? Because, trying to stick handle what a company is doing with a local community is one thing, but then to try and stick handle around what government, as well intended as it may be, is trying to do without getting in its own way. That complicates things immeasurably.
You actually took the words right out of my mouth, because I see a number of people in politics, in different levels of politics, with great intentions. turning those great intentions into actions seems to be contrary to our political system. And
good policy doesn't make good politics.
I don't know a lot about politics, to be very honest, but the Ring of Fire is a good example where I always pictured if the parties could get together, it would move forward. But that's not the role of the opposition. The opposition isn't there to support the government. And anyway, I don't understand it.
Well, almost every party's been in opposition since I started hearing people talk about Ring of Fire. So everybody shares some of that responsibility.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think people don't understand either. Like, I've been up the site a few times. It's in Ontario. It's not that far away compared to some of the mines we work at, but it is very remote. And it's a very unique landscape. Like when you fly over there, it's just a whole bunch of puddles. It's so flat, and it's, from an engineering perspective, it's difficult to build on without disturbing a lot, without harming the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of engineering that had to go into it to figure out how to do it right. But after saying all that, it's not unengineerable. I don't know, I just made up a word there.
Right.
It's not impossible. But when you combine it with 11 or 12 Indigenous communities, and I think this is something as Canadians we sometimes don't understand. We think that our Indigenous population has certain desires and needs. Every community is different. And when you talk to one community about what they're interested in, it might be economic. When you talk to another community, they might be worried about the environment. Third community might be worried about their youth leaving. Mm-hmm. Once there's jobs created, they're making money, they're leaving, they're not coming back. Every community is different. And again, I say, forget about Indigenous. If you had 12 communities you had to coordinate to come together on one project, how would that look? 12 municipalities trying to figure out where to dispose of nuclear waste. Mm-hmm. That's an unfair one, but it's a complicated situation. And on top of that, our Canada governs mining provincially. Okay? Canada deals with Indigenous population federally. Okay? So the layers of government you have involved now have changed from a typical mining project. The exception is uranium, which is a federal, but all of our other mines are provincially legislated. Mm-hmm. So with Ring of Fire, you've got provincial government, federal government, 12 communities. And what Noront started out with as a junior, they had to raise money for this great deposit that no one was sure when it would happen. So it was very challenging on a lot of fronts.
So, and I've asked folks this before. I mean, a lot of this has come to light and probably more of a common conversation because of what is, the Ring of Fire represents in terms of the minerals that we're going to need.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to need them more now than ever because the federal government has decided we're no longer going to have vehicles that are run on fossil fuel. We need the EVs, we need the batteries, and they're back to the issue around having the minerals. It may be a manufactured crisis, but at some level there's a level of urgency here now, all of a sudden, that we didn't have a year and a half ago, and I wonder whether or not that helps or hurts.
So there is a sense of urgency, but I'll qualify that. And this is my opinion. Okay, we talk about critical minerals and the risk we have from other groups supplying them to our countries. Mm-hmm. As long as those minerals are cheaper to buy, it'll be very hard for us to build
even if it's dirtier lithium from China, et cetera.
Unfortunately, that's a situation now, and it's not a mining-driven situation; it's a market-driven.
Right.
Who's gonna, if you're developing a lithium mine in northern Ontario, and that lithium costs twice as much as what you can buy now from China, despite any security concerns or the disruption of the supply chain. The problem is, once the supply chain is disrupted, it'll take 4 to 6 years to create that other supply. So we've got a challenge now. We've got a problem, and we've got to get our heads around is how do we become self-sufficient and still do it economically?
Well, that was a broader question and a lesson that we should have learned from COVID-19.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we applied it to a number of other things and said we should be self-sufficient in PPE. And, I don't know that we have made any efforts to do that. So I would have been perhaps more optimistic about the prospects until I heard your answer right now that maybe we won't be as likely to be self-sufficient in that area.
There was a property in Quebec, and what the Quebec government did is invested in it. Okay? So they didn't give it money. They didn't do grants.
Ownership stake.
They became part owners.
Yeah.
And, that seems to me to be a sensible way to become self-sufficient as a country.
Skin in the game.
To begin to invest in the critical minerals that you've identified.
Right.
And I'm a taxpayer. You pay taxes?
I think so.
Yeah. I'm a taxpayer, and I always look at these things and say, what's in it for me as a taxpayer? I mean, if you're giving money to this big company, that might be great for mining. What's my return?
Right.
And, with some of these companies that are having trouble getting investors, why isn't the investor the government? As a taxpayer, I wouldn't mind being a shareholder in a venture that is going to make us self-sufficient in critical minerals.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's at least...
Anyway, I'm not running for office, so don't worry.
We shouldn't start the campaign.
My background will squash that campaign quickly.
Can't be doing a check on you. Yeah, well, no, you're right. If you look at it that way, even in terms of the return I would get on that investment versus the return, am I getting value for the money I'm getting in my taxes? There's a much broader conversation there to have. Listen, thanks for this. This has been a wide-ranging conversation, and it's good to talk to you. Thanks.
Yeah, I had some fun with it.
Thanks for listening to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. The series is produced for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. For more information, visit our website, northbayecho.ca.